In recent videos, I've gotten to show you guys some amazing Maori indigenous weapons, and we are going to get to the king of this warrior culture's implements because luckily I got to see a specimen, and it's a great one. If you look to our third warrior from the right, the naked one in the foreground, so pretty easy to spot, you'll notice he has a one-of-a-kind weapon in this illustration. Looks like a large green paddle. That is a mere Pounamu. It's part of this family of paddle-shaped clubs from New Zealand. We've got a koshite on the right, two wahaikas on the left, middle, and left of the bottom row. Top right, we've got a patu, P-A-T-U, so kind of a flat club, more general description. Another wahaika in the top middle, and then our mere on the left top. And you can see just in this image the variety of materials, right? So traditionally, short clubs would be made from wood, bone, specifically whalebone, stone, and jade. Well, you can guess which one of those was the most highly prized by the warriors. It was the jade, specifically green jade, called a Pounamu, as close as I can get, which translates as green stone, and it's commonly called green stone today. Now, in some places in New Zealand, the word mere was enough to denote that the weapon was made out of jade. In others, it wasn't, so then it was a mere Pounamu. I'll just stick with mere going forward. Well, as we've covered in other videos, the Maori warrior culture included basically showing off, right? So here's the famous haka. You're showing how unafraid you are, giving your opponents reason to fear you, and brandishing your weapons was a big part of it. So here, firearms, for instance, but you can imagine in the old days, the jade mere is really going to stand out. It was the most beautiful, precious material any of the weapons in that display was going to be made from. And the haka, by the way, has other cultural implications, so I'm no expert on that. That's putting it mildly. I'm just focusing on this aspect. Also, the mere was the hardest to make. We don't know how long it took to make one traditionally. Some sources actually say it took like a whole generation. That's kind of hard to believe, but many say years. Imagine just how long it would take to make something like this. So here's a stone club, a patu. That would be a patu onewa. O-N-E-W-A, so a stone club, obviously very similar to a mere except for the material. Well, jade is quite hard. This is nephrite jade, by the way, in case you're curious, the kind found in New Zealand. Well, this is going to be even more difficult to work with than a more commonly found stone, like in the previous example. And that's not just because of how hard the material is, but of what they had to work with. So they had to cut out the block of greenstone with quartz, sand, and water. Then you get down to carving this thing and polishing the surface. This is all done with things like sandstone, other stones, so just very laborious. And the end result was gorgeous, obviously. So this was a weapon held by a chief or someone of similarly high rank. Various sources agree this is the most highly prized weapon a Maori warrior could wield. These things generally ranged from 10 to 20 inches, the actual fighting models. There's others that we'll talk about. There are always some version of that famous teardrop outline. They were sharpened at the top, kind of that duckbill shape, and the sides. They were a symbol of authority, as you can imagine, often being possessed by, the most powerful person within one community. Individual specimens could become famous and legendary. Talked about this a little bit with the taiaha, the Maori spear, so even more so with the mere. They would be hidden often when not in use, kept in special containers. It seems it was such a potent material and object that it was even considered to have its own mana or spirit. And like I said, the actual implement itself, an individual specimen, could be legendary. People knew this one was used to kill Chief so-and-so and so-and-so at the battle of, you name it. They could be used the way that a deed of title is used in modern society for a piece of property. Let's read a quote from the 1800's. In the early part of this century, a splendid mere was buried secretly in a swamp in Southland to settle a dispute as to who was to inherit it. And similarly, one now lies hidden in a swamp beyond Riverton. End quote. Now let's get back to the one that we're looking at today. Just really stunning. You can see how it catches the light and reflects it back. Almost looks slightly translucent. You're going to go into battle in style with one of these tucked into your belt, which is where it was held, by the way. We're looking at the bottom, the butt end, which was used for striking. You could see where this point would maximize the effectiveness of that technique, but I would say this is not the typical shape. Usually they're more rounded. So I think it's safe to say some extra work went into this one on that portion. We touched on how overly large specimens, like the one on the right, weren't actually used for fighting. Yeah, look at that thing. It's huge. It's going to be really heavy. Too slow for combat. These were, used with one hand, by the way. It's a one-handed weapon. Often there'd be a buckler of some sort protecting the off arm, and that makes sense if you're going to go into battle with a one-handed weapon. And that way you've got defense and offense, and an ability to close in with an opponent who's got a longer weapon like a taiaha. The one on the right here, it would require two hands, but not give you that much reach, right? So you've got no defense, essentially, and not much reach, so then you might as well use a staff weapon. Here's a big one as well. So an extra large specimen would be more for show, but we're also told for executing prisoners. Speaking of prisoner executions, legend says that these were so highly valued that a captured warrior who possessed one would sometimes ask his captors to use it to dispatch him instead of a lesser, less noble instrument. Here's our expert and curator, again, holding a more fighting-oriented version. And all of this execution talk raises an interesting question about application. We go deep on this channel, guys. That long specimen there, you would clearly assume it's going to be used in a swinging, chopping motion to dispatch your prisoners. But we are consistently told that mere and other short, flat clubs were used by the Maori mostly in a thrusting motion, thrusting and jabbing. Not with the expected, to us, axe-like swing. Now, that could be used, of course, you're going to hit with anything you can in battle, but it seems clear that thrusting was preferred, and concern about weapon breakage appears to be the main reason why. Let's quote from an 1892 source. The mere was not used like an axe for a downward hacking stroke. If used thus and parried, it might be broken, and thus the labor of years lost. And that makes sense, you want a flattened shape to maximize effectiveness and provide slashing as well as blunt force damage. Okay, so that's good, but one stone edge hitting another could equal your weapon breaking. And that would be even more so with less dense materials like the whalebone and wood. It's strange to imagine something with that big, that size and that oblong shape being used in almost a stiletto-like fashion, but there it is. Now, a major difference there is I'm not talking about in terms of targets, just striking motion. The targets are going to be bone and the more vulnerable ones that you can find and the exposed ones during fighting. So we're told temple, jaw, ribs. Having held this one here, I have absolutely no doubt that one shot to the temple would lay you out, if not kill you instantly. On that cheery note, legend also states that thrusting into the skull and following that up with a kind of jarring, prying motion would actually crack the skull completely open, or, kind of open it up. Fun times. And let's get even more gruesome and go back to the execution and that extra long model. Well, there's no way you would jab with that thing. So I would imagine that, if it's a prone prisoner just sitting there, you feel more than safe doing a swinging motion. You're not going to hit a stone weapon, right, when you're doing that. We're also told that because of the hardness of the jade, these could be made thinner than competing flat clubs. I can't say, having just recently held a couple of different wahaikas, that I notice a ton of difference, but anyway, here's the edge on this one, and you can see the sharpness. Meanwhile, let's talk retention system, right? There was that hole drilled through for the thong, the loop. Often that would be made of dog skin, and I showed you in my previous video how you would wrap that up and how it relates to my specialty, like seen here. Image from my book with one more coming. You had to make sure you had a retention system that didn't hurt you in more than one way. One, you wanted it to secure the weapon in place, and I showed the method in the last video for both short billy clubs, saps, blackjacks, and mere, or anything like that. So no, it wasn't just a simple matter of running your wrist through it. But then on top of that, you didn't want the weapon to be used against you. Old billy club patents, like this one here, often had, and the one below it, often had devices to make sure, this is in my book, you couldn't get caught in a wrist bind by someone who managed to grasp your weapon. So you didn't want your wrist loop to be used against you. Anyway, these, modern, this is here, 19th century, and there were 20th century versions as well. These modern inventions were trying to solve for what the Maori well understood as well. But instead of trying to solve for that problem with swivel components, etc., they used the hand wrap that I showed previously, and I've actually shown in multiple videos because, again, back to these kinds of weapons here. So, just an interesting note. Moving on. One expert and a Maori at that online and a curator said that the name itself, mere, implies faster strikes than the other kinds of stone clubs, patu. So I thought that was interesting. That fits in with the overall technique, though, that you see on these short, flat clubs in some of the demonstrations online. In some of the literature, they talk about how you use this weapon in an agile manner. Remember, this is unarmed combat, so you needed your footwork, you're trying to be fast, you're trying to move around, which is counterintuitive for us. It's just such a big stone implement. It's just not how we would think of it naturally. The stiletto analogy from earlier might be appropriate, in fact. Now, here's a modern one, not even made out of green jade, which is more desirable, and you can see it selling for $2,000. That's the asking price. So, yeah, they were valuable a long time ago, and they're valuable today, even a modern recreation. And that's why these things would be fought over. You might lose one in a battle, right? Another tribe, I'll use that word, I hope it's appropriate, might take one from you, and then you're going to fight to get that thing back. To that point, here's a quotation from a chief who was handing one over as part of a treaty negotiation. And I'll go ahead and try to say this specific Mera's name when I do this. Quote, "We hereby make over to you Paiwena, which we have always highly prized, from having regained it in battle after it was used by our enemies to kill two of our most celebrated chiefs." These were so valued that they were often buried with their owners, as you can imagine, say a notable conquering chief, that kind of a thing. But then they'd later be dug back up by the same family to be used again, and then buried again with a notable owner, and then dug back up again. So one chief, for instance, I found a quotation where he's talking about, how many of his ancestors had been buried with this particular mere that he was holding. Real interesting stuff. Let me give you a real-life fight anecdote, right? Those are always good. Warakino, a West Coast chief, had a spear run through his arm by Tuhuru, and, being violently pushed, fell upon his face. Before he could rise, Tuhuru caught him by the hair and was just about to smash his head with his mere when he recognized him as his own cousin and spared him. Yikes, not a second too soon, huh? Speaking of that Mortal Kombat finishing move, I'm referencing the old video game when I say that, here's a description. The left hand now grasped the hair of the enemy, the fingers being twined among the long locks. Then the blow was struck, rather as a stab, if possible, at the side of the head where the bones are weakest, and it was thus driven into the brain, end quote. And if you were the unfortunate victim in that scenario or defeated opponent, at least you were being killed by a mere, because that was a mark of honor, especially if it was a famous specimen, a legendary one. Well, here's one last look at the one I got to see and hold. Like I said, the king of Maori weapons. Really neat, gorgeous, deadly, pretty unique. I mean, we're talking about a weapon made entirely of precious stone. The kind of material jewelry is normally made out of. Not a lot of competition, if any, in world history and combat arts for that distinction. Well, hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks.